Hello, welcome to Sacred and Small Conversation in Liturgy and Mission. I am Jason Buckwalter, and my friend over here is
Jason Hill.
Friend. I use that lightly. No, not lightly. Anyway, welcome you to this week's podcast, video thing, whatever we're calling it.
I still haven't figured out the word vlog.
No, I don't like that. I have feelings about that, and
I do too. Actually, I 100% agree with you. Yes, this is I like that technical term, podcast video thing.
Yeah. Precision in language, that's what preachers are all about, and that is today's topic, actually, preaching.
What to preach.
And we're obviously, just by way of reminder, we're not necessarily experts in all of these things. We are both students working through a lot of these things, and our contexts are both small, and well, we care about it, and we're inviting you into the conversation. And so preaching is something that comes every week, unless you're blessed to have other folks who can preach for you. This last week I was really blessed. I was away at class, and I had a lay lady in our congregation preach for the first time, and did she absolutely phenomenal.
Did she preach? You know what I mean by preach, or did she talk preach? Either's fine. I'm just curious with a lay leader how you guys approached it.
Yeah, I think it was maybe more talk preaching, but it was preaching. I mean, she had it all laid out. We met beforehand the week before and kind of helped her guide crafting it together. But just in terms of some of the practical things that you can't teach a whole lot, some of the presentation aspects of things, she did really well.
Good.
And her content was good as well. And I don't get to sit and watch a lot of other people preach, and I hate listening to myself preach. So, but well, Jay, why preaching? Why do we preach? Why do we spend so many hours during the week preparing something so that we then might speak at or to?
I ask myself that question just about every Sunday. Why am I doing this? This is so much of my time and so much effort, and is it really worth it? You know? And it's an interesting question. Why do we preach? And I think, at least in our tradition, I think the answer is to some extent because we have to. Well,
so you're not an alumni of Nazarene Theological Center.
No, one day I might be if they let me graduate.
But the original motto of our denominational seminary was to make more preachers and better preachers.
More better preachers.
More preachers and better preachers. Yeah.
More preachers and yes, yeah. Well, that's one of the uniquenesses of our tradition, right?
So,
I don't know if it's a uniqueness, but it's one of our because it's not unique just to the Nazarenes. I mean, obviously, preaching has been around since I don't even know who gave the first sermon in the Bible. That's an interesting question.
Peter. Pentecost.
Well, the first New Testament one, but the prophets I mean, we got like Jeremiah standing on the street corner declaring things that no one wanted to listen to. I'd call that typical preaching. So
getting run out of town for it too.
Yeah.
Thrown in a well.
David at the end of his life, there's several examples. I'm sure there's Samuel, definitely. So definitely. I'm sure there's probably something with Abraham or something like that. But
Well,
first was God to Cain, maybe. I don't know, but
was the serpent the first sermon?
No, that's the first post-sermon conversation, where everything everything you just said is wrong. But yeah. No, I don't. But yeah, in our tradition, I mean, preaching is central. It's the thing, right? I mean.
Yeah, I think larger than that, just in evangelicalism, as a whole. So obviously, Church of Nazarene, we're in a Wesleyan tradition. We have our roots in the Methodist movement and all of those things, but equally as much in the 19th century holiness movement.
Right.
And,
in fact, probably more so than in Wesleyan tradition, where I mean, Wesleyan early Methodism was built around a class meeting structure, and they had societies too. And I'll explain if I need to what that is, but class meeting was a small group of 10 to 12 people who met for accountability in their actions, right? And you had to be a part of the class meeting in order to go to the society meeting, which was something kind of like a church service Although really the church service in early Methodism was the Anglican services that they still participated in on, I guess, Sunday morning. Probably, I would think would still be Sunday morning back then. But yeah. So yeah, our tradition of preaching as the primary expression of worship in our gathered worship, rooted in our holiness tradition, revivalistic tradition.
Yeah. Although I think that some of that has shifted a little bit as of late, as we've gotten to really good professional worship leaders. And so some folks will now say, like, the dominant part of our service should be this music. And as long as we've got the worship, then we don't need the preaching or the sacraments or anything else. And I think what we're saying is that, like,
are we hearing that with the preaching though? I definitely the sacraments, although I think that's coming back too. There's been, the pendulum swings both ways, but I don't know that I've heard that with the preaching. Shorter sermons maybe, but
I ran our teen camp for.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And some of the people we had come in and lead worship, certainly not all of them, they definitely felt like what they were doing was the most important part of the service. And one particular person just hijacked just everything. So we didn't have him back.
I can imagine that being the case.
Right. So it's not just a narrow, I think you and I say it's not a narrow understanding. Preaching is not, it's not the end all to what church is. So if it's not the end all, certainly it's proclamation,
right?
Declaring the gospel,
right?
I personally think that every sermon should kind of end up with Jesus in some way.
That would be one we could talk about. I don't necessarily disagree. But it seems like at least maybe in the 20th century, maybe before, I don't know. My preaching history is a little not quite maybe where it should be. I've been more focused on discipleship and things like that. But everything points to Jesus kind of concept. So like this next week, I'm preaching out of Genesis chapter 2, and so one tradition, one mindset is that you need to find Jesus and I'm not saying this is wrong. So.
Right.
Find Jesus and preach Jesus in Genesis chapter 2, which sounds good, except then you end up with the same message over and over again. Instead of letting Genesis chapter 2 be Genesis chapter 2 and let Jesus be Jesus, you end up sort of forcing Jesus in there to some extent, instead of maybe the concepts and the graces that Jesus represents.
Well, I think, I don't want to force anything, but I think that as we proclaim the word, it often kind of narrowly sometimes segues into, and Christ examples. I don't know. I blurted that out before I thought it through. So.
Oh no, but I think it's an interesting point, because I think a lot of people in our tradition, and I would say again, like you were saying earlier, basically evangelicalism, right? Would and the word I wrote down in our notes here, we have notes that we try to follow, by the way. Occasionally we glance at them. It's charisma, right? And that might be a term that's familiar to you. It might not be to our listeners and our viewers in this podcast vloggy thing that we have, right? Proclamation of the gospel, right? Of the gospel. So that every message that we preach, whether it's out of Genesis chapter 2 or John chapter 3, right? Every message we preach is oriented towards the salvation that Christ offers us. And maybe in the narrow sense, like literally leading people to a point of decision so they can say a prayer and transition from I was in hell, and now that I've done this prayer, I'm now in heaven. And that's what every sermon needs to be. There's a strong movement of that historically in our denomination.
Yeah, and that's not what I'm saying.
I know you're not, but I think it's an important point of clarification, right? Yeah.
Right. I guess if we are naturally moving, I know your congregation does this, and we're kind of moving in this direction. If you're going to celebrate the Eucharist each week, then there has to be something that ties into that. And I found more and more as I've used the Great Thanksgiving, the communion liturgy that we've used locally, which has been around forever and lots of people use it, is that more often than not, there's something within that narrative, and it's basically just a narrative of Christ and all the way the death and resurrection. And there's always something in that narrative, I find, that connects back to whatever the kind of main thrust of the passage we were looking at that week. And so I think that's kind of where I want that to go.
Right. And I think, yeah, and that makes, I totally understand what you're saying and agree wholeheartedly. But that's the distinction maybe between a Eucharistic or a sacramental centered liturgy, and to go back to last week, corporate liturgy or gathered liturgy, as opposed to sort of our folkish liturgies and our Nazarene or Wesleyan oriented liturgies, which almost treat preaching, I say Wesleyan, I mean holiness really is what I mean there, almost treat the act of preaching and the response to the sermon, often with a physical action like going to the sermon or going to the altar or raising your hand or whatever it is, almost treat that as a substitute sacrament for the Eucharist. And I think in our tradition, we don't emphasize sacrament historically. I think it's a vital part of our polity, but we don't emphasize it in our actual actions. Yeah. I would say that we have elevated the proclamation or the kerygma of the gospel to the level of sacrament, that it is a sacred act of grace through faith, a means of grace through faith that we participate in on a weekly basis. And therefore, with that being the case, we were allowing ourselves then to de-emphasize actual sacraments.
Right. Well, I think you can make a case for preaching in sacramental ways. But I think even practically, when you get ordained in the Church of Nazarene, one of the questions they're going to ask you is, do you have a call to preach?
You have a call to preach.
That's what matters.
Yeah.
And it's just placing all the eggs in one basket.
And one of the things we've struggled with, and just a little, pulling back the curtain here a little bit on our congregation, is defining what preaching is to a credentials board, a board of credentials that determines whether you who claim to have a call to preach actually has a call to preach. Because just right here, we've already seen that Jason Buckwalter's definition of preaching and Jason Hill's definition and understanding of preaching aren't necessarily 100% aligned. So if you look at that from a credentialing standpoint, that in order for us to be recognized by our denomination and our church as pastors and ordained elders in our church, that's what we call our ordained pastors as elders, you have to have a call to preach. And often we view that simply as a call to stand up in front of adult people and proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ in a church setting 52 times a year.
Yep. I was a youth pastor for 10 years. And I think when I got asked a question, do you feel a call to preach? It was always minimizing the work that I was doing with our.
It does, almost intentionally.
And for my part, I tried very hard to invest the same amount of time and energy in the gospel presentation, the kerygma, to our youth that I would when I get up on Sunday morning. Silence that phone, Jay.
Yeah, there's not really any way to do it because there's 5 phones here in these offices that we've got, and they just keep ringing. So, yeah.
so if
part of a live podcast, right?
Yeah. Right. So what do we hope to accomplish then with preaching?
That's a great question, and that's one that I think again goes to this conflict, because are we hoping to accomplish salvation? Where the goal of almost every gathered service is to get people to a point of salvation. Is it for discipleship, learning the word, teaching the word? Is it some sort of practical thing that you need to leave here and do? It's an interesting question. Well, how would you answer it? What do you think? And then I can think about my answer and decide whether I want to agree with you or not.
It's funny. So the class I was just in, the professor said, he doesn't believe in preaching anymore. So it caused me to think about, especially in light of
just for clarification, that's an evangelical seminary, right?
Northern Baptist. Yeah. So not the Southern Baptist, but the Northern ones. They're different.
The different. That's a new one. Northern Baptist. Yeah.
And so I think I think I grew up thinking that preaching was to accomplish that moment in time salvation, or in our tradition, that sanctification, that kind of
Oh,
crisis.
right. Yeah, we can't forget that one for us. Right.
Um, but the more and more I've engaged in ministry, preaching, especially to youth, uh, maybe as much so to adults, is that it is a formative moment, calling people to ask, who should I now be or become in the light of who Christ is,
Mhm.
rather than you're going to hell, you better say a prayer, a magical prayer.
Or just also more than here's 5 practical things that you could
Right.
do this week to have a better marriage or something. Not that those things are bad, but yeah, it's about being, right? We're trying to form people into beers.
Right. So the question is not necessarily application. I think that's the big thing, right? A lot of people talk about how do we apply this to our lives.
Right.
I'm not interested in that conversation as much as I am how are we to be allowed to be transformed by the Spirit of Christ working in us. And so that transformative thing is it's much more long term. It's a marathon that can be stretched out over years, because I think that's what it takes. And it's not a sprint. It's not I got to get this done, or you're going to get hit by a car as you leave the building.
Right. And I think there's lots in our tradition and in our history where we want that sprint. We need that moment of salvation right now. And we believe that even if you think about like a revival service where you've got 5 or 6, services going on over the course of 4 or 5 days, that's a sprint as well. That's not a marathon, but you're hoping through that emotional sort of immersive experience that it'll be a powerful enough emotion that our heart will be changed and our actions will begin to change based around that. And that doesn't seem to be backed up with sort of proper understanding of the way transformation works. The things that we experience in a really emotional moment might stick with us, but we're changed through consistent habitual behavior. There's that word again.
Right. I don't know how many times I got saved as a child.
Oh yeah.
Or a teenager at camp.
Yeah.
Or when I was struggling with the fact, like, I know I'm following Christ. I love the church. I love Christ. I love all of those things. And then there would be this really emotive altar call, and I wouldn't want to go down. And there was this internal struggle about, like, I'm such a, why can't I submit? Just all this baggage.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think you're right. We need those moments, because sometimes we don't know what, the work has been done in someone's life moving up to that point.
Right. Often those moments
of God working through that person.
Yeah, are sort of the culmination of the marathon that's gone into it, right? And then the evangelist that's coming into the camp gets to take the credit for the work of generation of families. But
notches in the belt. Right,
notch on the belt, right? I don't know how many. I mean, well, I've got stories I can share, but we won't go into them today. But yeah, preaching for transformation, preaching for being. So do you feel like you need like here's three things you can do this week? Do you feel like you need that at the end of your sermon?
No, I don't. I'd much rather say, well, sometimes I do. It just depends on what the text is.
Right. What the text demands.
Mm-hmm. Clearly, there's some text parables, or John the Baptist, repent. That's one of the things. This is how you repent.
Right.
How you maintain that. I think I'm more apt to ask questions for people to ponder during the week. Now, whether they do, I don't know. Introspective questions, ways in which, and I might offer practices, right, that are habitual things. These are ways to forgive. I think that's much more helpful than just saying you need to forgive.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think it's all of those things. We need the salvation aspect. We need the formation. We need calling people to an action at times. But I think it comes down to allowing the Spirit to work in us, to transform us into people who look like Christ.
Mm-hmm. So I've got a question for you.
Sure.
And I'm sure you were just about to ask the same question, but how do you determine what you're going to preach on any given Sunday? I mean, isn't that the big thing pastors do? We're sitting in our office
Yeah.
thinking, what in the world am I going to say on Sunday? And Sunday comes every Sunday.
Right. Or Wednesday night, if, you know, back in my youth pastor.
Yeah, right.
And I used to fret a lot about all of that, you know, and you get something, you pick something out and you wouldn't feel it and struggle some more. So I started using the Revised Common Lectionary. And so if you're unfamiliar with that, it's been around forever. It's a 3-year cycle of texts that there's a psalm, there's an Old Testament reading, there's a New Testament epistle reading, and then a gospel. And so those will guide you over kind of 3 years. And so like I used Logos, it's Bible, you know, Bible software. I have my lectionary in there, and I go through, and I can actually, if I can share my screen, you have disabled that. Anyway, I've got a whole spreadsheet. Maybe we can put it up afterwards. I have a whole spreadsheet that's got the entire year mapped out, and I'll throw scriptures in there and from the lectionary and try to weave together weeks that are kind of continuous, because the lectionary can work that way.
I think you can share now. Try it now.
Okay. All right. Here we go. You're going to see like the entire thing here.
Wow.
So I share this with our worship leader and our children's worker. So we've got the week of the year. We've got a call to worship. We've got the text.
Wow, you have the call to worship and everything.
We have the title, and if there's a series. So we did waiting with Jesus for Advent last year. Won't you be my neighbor? For Lent, and then so like there's a sermon sentence, and this is getting deeper into just how I choose, but just so our worship leader can pick songs appropriately, because he's part-time, he's not always in. And then we've got the children's lessons that match that at times. And so info for our newsletter and what songs we're going to sing, he puts them in there. And so it's just it's a way for me to organize it. And I think when I step back and look at a spreadsheet like that, I can see the entire year just a little bit more clearly and identify maybe themes that need to be worked out, as well as trying to balance New Testament and Old Testament.
Yeah. So how does that develop? Like I've got something similar. I thought I was super organized, but now apparently I'm not.
It doesn't come naturally for me.
Yeah. So how does that develop? I'm like it looked like you had the whole year there. Mm-hmm. So do you sit down in like one massive week and you do all of that?
No, not generally. So it'll start here. I can do. I want to share it again, and I'll go to next year.
Next year.
Next
year. By next year, you mean year
B,
right?
Year B starting in Advent, and so normally I'm a little ahead of where I was maybe last year in planning. And so we have children's curriculum that we follow that follows the lectionary as well.
Yeah.
So a lot of times, and this year I'm going to try really hard to preach the same text as is in the children. I think that's important sometimes, at least to encourage conversations with people. But as you can see, I don't have titles. I don't have sermon sentences.
Yeah.
There's no songs. Although my wife has done a lot of work with the children's stuff, and all the people who need access to all this information have it. So I'll go, and it's not uncommon for me to go through and say, okay, during Easter, these texts and Acts, they're not working, or we're getting really tired of King David narrative in 1st and 2nd Samuel, and to change that up as kind of needs change. So it's a fluid work in progress that just kind of emerges as time goes by. But it's my process, and I know not everybody's gonna be like that. But it provides some flexibility along with guidance.
Yeah,
where we're going as a church.
So let me share mine. This is, and then I want to talk about the opposite, because I think that what in some ways is sort of our own influence on ourselves, probably, where we have been working through these together for years and come up with these systems that now work for us. whereas this might be wholly new for our listeners. And jumping into something like yours, that's going to be pretty complex. So I'm not saying
And maybe a little intimidating. I realize.
maybe a little intimidating. So for us, what I do, I sit down every August, and it used to be just by myself, but now we've got a little bit of a couple part-time associate pastors in, and we sit down and we develop this, which, as you can see, it's similar. Now, unlike Jason Buckwalter's, yours is organized around the lectionary. Ours is sort of inspired by the lectionary, but organized by sermon series. So I use I don't know if you do this or not, but I use the lectionary to inspire series preaching, as opposed to just preaching whatever is in the lectionary. So some of these passages are in the lectionary, but they might not even be, like, for example, in September, I already mentioned that we're in Genesis right up here. We're in Genesis. I have no idea whether the lectionary is in Genesis or not right now. The lectionary might have been in Genesis in October or December or last August, but we sit down, we look at the lectionary, we write it all out. We considered what we did the year before or 3 years before, and we come up with series. And so, yeah, we're doing a series called Foundations right now, which walks through kind of the first half of Genesis. And then we're going to move into a Thanksgiving series where we're going to look at a couple different things, and then on into Advent where we're going to focus on the Psalms. And you can see for us, we just kind of have sort of a general statement or even just a verse. And then I do, for the sake of my associate pastors, I do go ahead and put down who's going to be preaching what sermon. So they've got a whole year's worth of schedule there for them. We're trying to do more of a group style approach to preaching. So at least once a month, someone else is in the pulpit and I'm not, which I think works really well for us.
I think that's fabulous with series, and I'll do some of that. Usually during the fall, after school starts up, we'll do some kind of big series that tackles maybe a theme or something like that. But I'll try to work series within the lectionary text as well. So and modify them to suit our needs, because I think some people think that it's too restrictive. You got to think of it as guidance and not prescription.
So what would you say to that person who, because I've heard this and I've encountered this and I almost had to deal with it with some of the retired pastors that are in my church as we've tried to team up a little bit. What would you say to the person who says, well, I really want a fresh word from God this week?
Well, I think even in planning, you're open to the Spirit's guidance to change things. And it doesn't mean, as I approach these scriptures as time goes by, it doesn't mean that God isn't speaking as I craft that individual sermon, or even if I've written ahead of time, which is kind of my practice. I get the text written ahead of time, and then the week of, I spend all week with that text. And a lot of times that what I've written changes substantially by the time Sunday morning rolls around. And so I am in my office by like 5 a.m. on Sunday. We have service at 10:30, and I'm going over that and prayerfully considering. And that time is always super fruitful in saying, in being attentive to what God is saying, wants to say to us through that text. Right. Spirit plans.
Yeah, and I just sort of give you a practical example of that. Here I don't know when you're listening to this or watching this, but for us, it's the end of September 2020, and we're still in COVID. We've got we're meeting, we've gathered. Right now we're meeting in a barn outside for the next few weeks. But back in March, sermon series that I had scheduled over a year in advance. When COVID first hit, the sermon series that I had scheduled, it was a Pentecost-oriented series, right post-Easter, basically, was "We Are the Church" was the title of the series, and we were just walking through the book of Acts. And so there you go. Did not plan for COVID, had no idea that was going to happen, but planning a year out, still had exactly what God was wanting to speak to us in that moment, in that season, talking about a scattered church, a church that was scattered by, in that case, persecution, right? And how the church developed in scattered environments and homes and extended families throughout the, Roman Empire.
An excellent opportunity to explore what it means to be the church.
Right. And here we're sitting here amazed. It's like, wow. I mean, if we could not have picked a better topic for this series for this time and season of our church. And then right after that, we started doing a series on the minor prophets and the whole, Black Lives Matter and social unrest and all of that was going on at that same time. And here we are, sort of like, who knew, who knew that it was going to time out so well. So the Lord plans, and sometimes he plans in advance, and he knows what we need.
Prior proper planning prevents poor performance.
Ooh, I'm not going to.
That's become somewhat of a household motto. My wife is like type AAA, and so some of that has rubbed off on me. She's not just type A, but triple.
Yeah.
Triple A. So I don't know how much time we've got left, but how long are your series? What do you really go?
I used to do anywhere from 6 to 12. I'd do a couple 12-week series. I've just decided that's way too long. So,
yeah, I think it is.
So now I try to stick with like 4 to 8. If it's really complicated, I might do 8. But yeah, probably 6 weeks is about as far as we go. And then we'll come back to it. Like we're doing Genesis now, and that's a repeat of something we did a long time ago. But before this one, we did the book of Romans, and over a 3-year span, we divided Romans up into 2 parts. So I did I did all 16 chapters. I think there's 16 chapters in Romans. And I probably did 14 sermons spread over 2 series, no more than 6 to 7 per series. It was a little awkward because it was 2 or 3 years between series, and we had to come back and sort of explain what he was talking about in the first 8 chapters, but it worked. And so, 8 weeks is probably the most I'd do right now.
Have you ever gotten into a series and said no, we're
every one of them
eject?
Yeah. Well, and I have more often. I extend series than I do eject because I find that there's more there that I want to cover, or something's important. So I might add a week here and subtract a week from something there. But the problem that I run into with this planning thing is that I'm always trying to look ahead and think ahead a little bit. So when I was at the end of Romans, I was thinking about Genesis and kind of got excited about Genesis and sort of got a little tired of Romans, because Romans is hard. It's hard to preach. And, so sometimes that happens, but I think in my case, having other people part of the process has helped me with that, because our 2 associate pastors bring totally different perspectives to what we do. And so I get to listen to them, and they get to argue with me about what I should say a little bit and push back with, I mean, in a good way, well, I see this, right. I see this, and we develop kind of our concepts in a corporate way. But I realize that not everyone has that luxury. We just happen to have some people in our church who have that call to preach. So
yeah, I think that's wonderful. And that's something that I crave from time to time. Like, okay, I need to work this out. I think that's one of the things that's great about the lectionary is that you're probably not the only church in your town that might be looking at that passage.
No, you're definitely not.
And so if you can develop relationships with other clergy in your town, even your small town, like we got 12,000 people, and so got 4 other pastors that I know real well, and we work together on things like that. And so
and online, lots of online stuff, community stuff. Talk about it too.
Which actually probably share some resources there, and I think we can put links to some of these down in the description
on the YouTube channel, at least. Definitely,
yeah. I think they show notes on the iTunes or whatever. So the Book of Common Prayer, which is more than just a lectionary, but has it included in it. Mm-hmm. And so there may be lectionaries that are specific to your denomination as well. Mm-hmm. I know the United Methodist has one that's specific. At least one branch of the Lutherans has one, and that's different usually than the Methodist or the Revised Common Lectionary. Mm-hmm. But you can find those texts too at Vanderbilt's library, and I'm not going to read out the entire URL there, but lectionary.library.vanderbilt.edu.
Right. But it's the first search. If you search in Revised Common Lectionary, I think it's the first search that comes up. Usually it's the Vanderbilt one.
Yeah. And then 2 of my favorite websites are textweek.com and workingpreacher.org. And Working Preacher will have commentaries people have written on the upcoming lectionary passages, and Text Weeks have a whole bunch of different artistic things, links to all the other kind of things pictures, songs, things like that.
Mhm.
So,
My favorite resource is Jason, because if I have a question about like Genesis, I just text you. 'Cause,
right,
yeah,
last week you texted me, I was in the middle of class and just
you
like,
missed you missed a serious theological conversation that you would have enjoyed because you were in class, but that's your fault.
no. Yep. One more we can say, a plainaccount.org.
Yeah, in our
That's one that's associated with our denomination. It's
Yeah.
just kind of generically Wesleyan, but the people who run it are largely Nazarene, and they also do commentaries from a Wesleyan perspective on there. And I actually participate in that website a little bit. There are like discipleship lessons that are on there as well. You can look by scripture or by place in the church year. That's not really self-promotion, but it's just a good resource.
It is. It's a good resource. Yeah. Well, that's it. What to preach? I think we created a great deal of confusion and answered absolutely no questions, but we had a good conversation about it.
And I think for me, whenever I listen to things like this, I always get guilty when I don't do it that way. And we didn't even talk about how to structure a sermon, like sermon forms.
Oh yeah, we should think about
and going through seminary or listening to things like this, I'm like, I have to do it that way.
Yeah.
And I just had to learn over the years to give myself permission to craft my own way of deciding what to preach, deciding how that sermon looks, and all of those things. And I think probably come back at another time and look at the actual preaching moment and how we go about shaping those things. But that's later down the road, probably.
I think it'll be a regular topic for us because it's so vital to our traditions and our liturgies and our mission, for that matter too. Yeah. All right. Well, there we go. And we'll be back here soon talking again. I think this time about mission will be our next major topic we tackle, and starting to get more practical, but also still dealing with a lot of these big overarching issues that guide the church. So, yeah. Like and subscribe no matter where you're watching this video / podcast thing. Like and subscribe, share it with your friends, and we certainly appreciate you being with us today.
We do.
Yeah. May the grace and peace of the Lord be with you, Jason.
And also with you.
Yeah. Have a great day.